Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 261 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Last week, we looked at the story of Richard II and Henry IV, and the way these two cousins wielded the power of the English crown. Since Shakespeare had such an influence on what we know about their stories, it seems fitting to round out the cycle that makes up the Hollow Crown by looking at the next king, one who many have called England's greatest. Enter Henry V. My next guest needs almost no introduction. He's the best-selling author of The Plantagenets, The Templars, The Wars of the Roses, and Crusaders, the host of the podcast This Is History, and the man RuPaul falls asleep watching on Netflix. I'm speaking, of course, about Dan Jones. And speaking of completing cycles, Dan's latest book fits neatly into his series of books on the kings of England. It's called Henry V, The Astonishing Triumph of England's Greatest Warrior King. Our conversation on Henry, his years as a prince, and his legendary kingship is coming up right after this. Well, welcome back, Dan. I feel like I've been in withdrawal. We haven't spoken to each other for ages when we were speaking to each other all the time. It's nice to see you.
Yeah, but we didn't fall out.
We did not.
From my perspective, although maybe we did, that it could be one of those things where we fell out and like one of the people doesn't realize it.
No, I'm trying to say I missed you. I missed your face.
You just come out with it and say, I missed you.
Okay, I missed you, Dan.
Welcome
back.
Glad we're doing this.
Me too. All right, so we are here to talk about Henry V. And what I like about this book is that you're really upfront at the beginning saying that this is the book that you had wanted to write. You left yourself a Henry-shaped hole in your magnum corpus and you wanted to talk about Henry. Why Henry?
Well, let's talk about the Henry-shaped hole, which is a bit like a sort of heart-shaped box or whatever. The second book that I ever wrote was called The Plantagenets. The third was called The Hollow Crown or The Wars of the Roses. And those two books together almost chronicled the whole of the Plantagenet dynasty from Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine through to, well, in fact, the Hollow Crown went up to the early reign of Henry VIII, but it was the Plantagenet chronicles. But Plantagenets finished in 1399 with the deposition of Richard II, and the Hollow Crown took up in 1420 with the marriage of Henry V and Catherine de Valois, because structurally for that book, Catherine de Valois was important because there you got the Tudor line, because she would later marry Owen Tudor, etc. So there, the gap was inherent to the structure of those two books, but I was also aware that it was a very interesting chronological gap to leave, because Henry V, by sort of common consent in his day thereafter, for hundreds of years thereafter, was considered the medieval goat, the guy who did it best. He mastered the job, and although of all the Plantagenet rulers of England that were crowned, so let's discard Edward V, Henry ruled for the second shortest amount of time after Richard III. He seemed to do everything. He brought justice, law, order at home, and he conquered France, essentially. So that's what you're supposed to do, and he did it. So that makes for an interesting case study. My new book, Henry V, is a case study in power, in kingship, in leadership in a time of crisis, all of those things. And Henry is a really good way to study. I know you've talked to Helen Castor already about Richard II and Henry IV. Richard II is also an excellent case study in kingship because he does it so badly. People who do things very well or very badly are typically interesting as broader stories, as characters to study. Henry V is also kind of weird, and that makes for a good biography as well. He's personally unlike anyone else who ever does this job. I'd never written a biography before, so it's interesting in the biographical form to grapple with weirdos.
To grapple with weirdos. I think that should be just your professional tagline, grappling with weirdos. That does cover a lot of medieval history.
A lot of my podcast interviews, Danielle. Present company accepted. Sorry,
yes. Waiting for that.
Slow, huh?
Waiting for that. Right. Okay, so mostly Henry V is known for Agincourt. Of course, this is his big moment, especially in Shakespeare. But you don't start there. You start with the moment that Henry has an arrow in the face. Why did you start there?
Well, he fought two battles, not one. Agincourt is, as you say, the most famous one. But I think Shrewsbury in 1403, on the 21st of July, 1403, when he's 16 years old, commanding the rear guard in his father's army, is a deeply interesting and potentially pivotal moment in the life of Henry V, in the course of English royal history, indeed. He's seriously wounded at Shrewsbury, and as Michael Livingston, the great military historian, has written about extensively and brilliantly, he's shot in the face with an arrow shot from a longbow. It's buried to the depth of 6 inches in his skull. It's a miracle, and we use that word advisedly. It's a miracle that he survives. And then he goes through this long operation at the hands of the brilliant surgeon John Bradmore to remove the arrowhead, which takes the best part of a month. It's an incredible piece of surgery, opening the entry wound that the arrow went in through, not killing the patient, keeping it clean, stopping it getting infected, designing the tool to withdraw the arrowhead, closing it up, maybe or maybe not leaving a physical scar. And this is out of what I think is a formative, pivotal moment in Henry V's life. So I chose to start the book there, partly to subvert this idea that Henry is all and only about Agincourt, partly because I think that it's useful in this biography to sort of shift focus to his youth. And I say that for 2 reasons, partly because I think a lot of biographies of Henry don't deal adequately with his youth. It sort of takes up 1 or 2 chapters at the beginning of the books, whereas in fact this is a guy who was not king until he was 26 and was dead at 35. So for most of his life, he's not a king. So I think he deserves in a biography a detailed study of his apprenticeship in order that we can understand his kingship. So starting at Shrewsbury takes us into that world. And I think it also serves to suggest a counterweight to the Shakespearean image of Prince Hal and of this youth of, Shakespeare does give Henry the sort of proper biographical shape of concentrating a lot on his youth as well as his adulthood, kingship. But Shakespeare invents Prince Hal, the layabout, roistering, drunken, womanizing kind of guy I like to hang out with, But that's not accurate. And starting the book with a very different view into Henry's adolescence, I think it was a way of setting out my stall and saying, you're not looking at the Henry you thought you might know.
Yeah. I think that's super important. And speaking of formative, getting an arrow in the face while defending the realm is going to be formative in all sorts of ways. You mentioned last week I spoke to Helen Castor about Richard II, about the usurpation of Henry IV, and we didn't get to talk too much about what things were like at the beginning of Henry IV's reign. So maybe this is a good opportunity to talk about what it's like for the future Henry V in this climate of a usurpation, because this is really formative to him as well.
Well, amid the white heat of the usurpation of 1399, the future Henry V is with Richard. Bolingbroke's in exile. And I apologise if I'm covering material you talked about with Helen, but Bolingbroke's in exile. Young Henry's with Richard in Ireland. He's been knighted by Richard. Richard's treated him pretty well, in fact, subsequent to exiling his father. He's sort of a hostage, but he's well treated. When the news breaks of Bolingbroke's rebellion, his invasion of England and the uprising in support of him against Richard doesn't do away with young Henry. He doesn't give him the featherbed treatment that old, Thomas of Woodstock got in the pub in Calais.
Mm-hmm.
He's decent to him. And I think that young Henry, Prince Henry at this stage, remembers that. And in some ways it will govern his later actions. Reburying Richard in Westminster rather than leaving him in King's Langley where Bolingbroke put him. But then what is life like after 1399? So without rehearsing the events of it in too much detail, because I assume you've done that already. Now he's a very young, what we would call teenager, and he's a heartbeat away from becoming king, and everything's changed. And he has to pretty quickly learn how to be a king because it could come at any moment. And there is a great deal of unrest in England. There's a great deal of unrest elsewhere in the British Isles as well. One of the first things that Henry IV does is lead an army to Scotland. And young Henry, Prince Henry, future Henry V, and his brother Thomas are taken on that campaign, and they see a pretty ignominious English campaign to Scotland, but it is an opportunity, I think, for Henry to see what the logistics of a major military campaign look like for a second time, if we include, his expedition with Richard. fairly shortly thereafter, he's sent to Wales because the insurgency, the rebellion of Owain Glyndŵr breaks out. And Owain Glyndŵr is, of course, claiming to be Prince of Wales, which is the title that young Henry, Prince Henry, has been awarded by Parliament as his father's heir. He's Prince of Wales, Duke of Aquitaine, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester. So this is a direct challenge, not just to Henry IV, Owain Glyndŵr, I mean, it's a direct challenge to young Henry. And Henry IV packs him off to Wales, more or less, and says, go and sort it out. Go learn how to be a warrior, how to be a prince, how to be a leader of men in Wales. And he sends him mentors, obviously. Hotspur is what Henry Hotspur, the heir to the Percy earldom in the north. Thomas, Earl of Worcester, is another member of the Percy family also, who has a sort of task babysitting, mentoring young Henry. So that's his training ground in many ways, and he's got to learn all the things you need to learn if you're subduing a gigantic tax rebellion and full rebellion against English authority. So it's learning the business of siegecraft, how to reduce castles, how to deploy cannon, how to get the correct ratio of men-at-arms and archers, how to pay troops, how to go beg money from his father's parliaments, how to wheedle for loans, how to move his own money around in order to fund this very difficult and expensive military operation, how to persuade men to keep fighting when they haven't been paid for 2 months and they're feeling sore about it. So he spends several years learning all that. And then at the age of 16, is cast into full battle at Shrewsbury against the rebellious Percys, Hotspur now leading the opposition against the Lancastrian crown, claiming to have a revived Richard II to put back on the throne. And Henry has to literally fight for what's his. And then, to return to where we started, then this incredibly painful, long, precarious operation that he has to go through. So it's a hands-on apprenticeship. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's being put in charge of armies, including very difficult decisions like what to do with traitors at the age of 14. So when people talk about his conduct later when he's a king, and we can get to that shortly, where he gets accused of being too brutal in some cases. I mean, he's already dealing with traitors in a terribly brutal fashion as a young teenager. This isn't new to him. It's something he had to deal with very early.
Yeah, and look, I think the story of Henry's apprenticeship under his father, or certainly the early part of it, is of a sort of ceaseless round of rebellions against the Lancastrian new royal dynasty. And that leaves very little room for being soft or being indecisive. And when he's king, he becomes an extremely determined, pretty consistent and consistently harsh judge and ruler. And he's, as king especially, not given to partisanship or favoritism. And I think that, again, if we go back to this rebellion of Hotspur and Thomas Percy, who were his mentors, rebel against the crown. And very nearly is the complete undoing of all of their family, and he's nearly killed because of it. So later, when he becomes king, if we think of 1415, just before the Agincourt expedition, as it turns out to be, sets off for Harfleur, there's the Southampton plot, in which a lot of the dank memes of Henry IV's reign are revived. Like, it's Owain Glyndŵr is back, Richard's back, they're going to put the Earl of March on the throne, John Oldcastle, a Lollard heretic and traitor, is lurking around this. And the key point about the Southampton plot, which shows just how, I mean, it's often portrayed as ruthless, and maybe that is the right word Henry is as a king, is that his friend Henry, Lord Scrope, Masham, is involved to some degree in the Southampton plot. And Henry, Lord Scrope, says, I knew about it. I was trying to gather as much information about it, and then I was going to present it to you, but you found out about it before I presented you the information. Maybe not, though. And it's also reported to Henry that Scrope's been saying this French expedition's a bad idea, and he's undone if he goes, and he's undone if he stays. He's got himself into a right old pickle here. That's not the exact quote, but that's the spirit of it. And this is a close ally of Henry's from his time as prince, and insofar as he ever had these things, a friend. And he has him executed. His head chopped off summarily, and the one weeps, so it's said, as his friend is taken to his death. But there is no mercy. There's no special pleading because you're sort of mates with the king. It's absolutely consistent because he's personally experienced the consequences of screwing around I don't mean that in the vulgar sexual sense, because that's the last thing we see Henry V doing, of like messing around, of letting things slide. It's absolutely clear. And he says it right towards the end of his reign. One of the many sieges in France, when it's after the Treaty of 1420, by which he becomes heir and regent of the French crown. He's offered a siege with his brother Thomas. There's a case of sort of ill discipline, and it's said that one of the men among the English army has allowed a prisoner to escape, has sort of taken pity on a prisoner. And this is a long-standing veteran, somebody who's been around for years and years and has really gone through the ringer with all of them on these campaigns. And Henry sentences him to death. And Thomas, Duke of Clarence, his brother, gets down on his knees and begs for this guy's life. And Henry says, brother, if it was you, I'd do the same thing. There's no grey area at all. Old John Oldcastle experiences the same thing. And John Oldcastle is a fool. I mean, Oldcastle was, again, a friend insofar as Henry had them. He was somebody Henry had relied upon during his days as prince. He's sent out to intervene in the Burgundian Armagnac civil war in France, along with staunch allies of Henry, the Earls of Arundel and Warwick, veterans from the Welsh wars. Oldcastle is as close as you get to Henry V, but he's also a Lollard. And when Henry's king, there are complaints about Oldcastle's flagrant lollardy, heresy, and Oldcastle assumes that he's mates with the king, so he can do what he likes. And he finds out the very hard way that he can't, because Henry hands him over to be judged, and he's found guilty of heresy. And that's that. He has to, he escapes from the Tower of London and goes on the run for 3 years. But when he's run to ground, John, Duke of Bedford, then presiding in Henry's absence on campaign in England, Bedford has Oldcastle killed on a Lollard gallows, burned and hanged at the same time, as a traitor and a heretic, the Lollardy plus plotting against the crown. But there's no hint that this is something that Henry the king across the water in France wouldn't have approved of. It doesn't matter that you're friends with the king. And so Henry is presented as a brutal, barbaric, cold, callous individual, whatever, all of these adjectives I've seen in print written about him. And you read him like that if you want, but there's no ambiguity. What you're getting is someone who's all business and no special pleading. And if you don't understand that, well, as Mos Def said, the hard-headed always got to feel it to believe it.
That's not in the book. Maybe that should have been in the book.
in Powers and Thrones, I put things like that in the footnotes, but I restrain myself in this book.
Oh, there's still
not totally. There are some quips in the footnotes.
Yeah, there's still some beautiful footnotes, which make me laugh out loud, which is why I enjoy reading your book so much, because there's always a moment where I have to stop and laugh because they're apt. Your footnotes are always apt and also very funny and usually quite modern. Right. So I want to stick with heresy for a second, because I think that religion is a big part of Henry's life. And you take a moment in the book to talk about a moment in which Henry is present at the execution of a heretic. So can you tell us a little bit about that incident and why you wanted to pull it out?
Right. So this is when Henry is still Prince of Wales. It's 1410. At which point he's about 23 years old at this point, I think. And there's a tailor from Evesham in the Midlands in England, Cotswolds, Midlands area. And Evesham is a Lollard. Again, should probably have defined this word Lollard. He's a follower of the heresies of John Wycliffe, the radical Oxford theologian protected by Henry's grandfather, John of Gaunt, who'd come up with all sorts of what I suppose we can very loosely call proto-Protestant positions on the sacrament, on church wealth, lots of things that Martin Luther would later take up with even greater enthusiasm 140 years later. Badby is, an ordinary artisan, just an ordinary dude, really, and he's a Lollard. And but in 1410, Lollardy has been pretty much tolerated, although it's illegal. There haven't been sort of mass burnings. There hasn't been one for years and years, but Badby is a sort of a scapegoat, really, because Lollardy has this particular political moment around 1409-10, where there's a big move in Henry IV's reign is bedeviled by financial crises as well as rebellions. And there's a moment in which one of Henry's parliaments, the Commons present, or certain Lollards in the Commons present a petition that asks the king to consider massive land redistribution, effectively, and wealth redistribution from the church to the state, re-endowing the crown, finding money for sort of goods like early humanist causes like setting up new universities and so on and so forth by dissolving bits of the church and stripping it of its wealth, stuff that Thomas Cromwell would much later have highly approved of. So this is a big political problem for the crown, which has no intention of doing anything like this. And it's not to the taste either of men like Archbishop Arundel, the Archbishop of Canterbury of the day. And Badby becomes a scapegoat. He's been banged up for ages for his lollardy, but no one's that keen on doing anything with him until this all blows up in Parliament. So Badby's put on trial, asked to recant his heresy. This is a long story short, refuses, and so is sentenced to burn, and he's burned in a barrel. So he put, stake, sticks, flames, but a barrel is placed around him to concentrate the fire and immolate him more speedily and spectacularly. Henry, as prince, really the power in the kingdom at this point, given his father's intermittent but progressive slide into serious illness and decrepitude. Prince Henry represents the crown at the burning of John Badby. And it's an interesting moment because here's a public moment where he has a choice to make. He is the sort of coming man. He's the younger generation. He could step forward and say, we're going to show mercy to Badby, or he can burn him as a heretic. So, but he plays it quite cleverly because he steps forward and he offers Badby, has the barrel removed, and says, "You can recant now. I'll pay you a pension for the rest of your life. It'll be okay. Just come back to the sort of orthodoxy of the church and behave yourself, for God's sake." This is not just offering poor old Badby, who's I think probably got ready to be flash fried, burnt ends, or whatever it is. I mean, technically at the moment, so barbecue is on my mind. For poor old Badby is really just, this is a public spectacle. And Henry is sort of offering peace with the Lollard. You don't have to burn, you can just chill out.
It's funny because he kicks away the kindling while the guy, he's already half burned.
He's like, I'm just about to get burned. I was ready for this. And my foot is actually on fire. Anyway. So they go, all right, stick him back on. And Henry from that point on is sort of, well, look, I gave you your chance. And from that point on, he is, again, no ambiguity with regard to Lollardy. It's heresy and he's not going to stand for it. But he's had this moment at which he's kind of quite cleverly played it both ways. So this burning of Badby is a spectacular thing that people will remember for many years to come. And Henry has placed himself at the centre of it and come down on the side of traditional religion and conservatism. And he doesn't really have much of a choice in that, but has shown himself willing to listen. And this is something that Henry V will show throughout his career and is part of why he's such an effective king. It's that he understands what I would call the Edward III playbook, which is you want to go fight, you have to provide justice and you have to listen. Listening is the most important thing, unlike a Richard II, who, if you complain, so anytime there's any complaint about Richard II, whether it's expressed to him directly, corporately by the Lords, in the Appellant crisis, or the Commons in Parliament, Richard, his head explodes and he becomes irate and starts threatening to kill people or get the King of France to invade. I mean, he's a very prickly kind of guy. And that's not how Edward III had sort of rebooted the monarchy. Edward III would go to Parliament and say, come on, give me your worst. Complain. Let's hear it all. Get it all out of your system. And then if these complaints are reasonable, where I can, I will remedy them. And then I would like some taxation to go and bash the French on the head, please. And everyone says, hurrah. You have to be quite secure and confident to do that. And of course, as we know, Edward III is nothing if not secure and confident. And Henry V is the same. In that respect, they're very, very different characters. I've been reading a lot about Edward III in the 1350s because I'm writing the third of my Essex Dogs novels at the moment. And Edward III throws these wild parties where everyone dresses up as sort of birds, and Edward's in a gigantic, big bird costume with mechanical flapping wings. You're not going to find Henry V in an ostrich, well, it's not an ostrich suit, it's a pheasant suit, actually. But politically, he understands this is how you do it. And he shows this even in the sort of Badby burning. This isn't dogma or blind, careless ideology. There is an element of I will listen. I am a reasonable person, but I am going to make a decision, and there might be unpleasant consequences to that. And I think that's good leadership.
Yeah, I mean, especially at this time, right? We might have different qualifications for what's good leadership now, but we're talking about a completely different time, which is something that you make clear when you're talking about Henry in the end, at the end of the book.
Yeah, the issues are different now, of course, but I think his history is not there to be a sort of manual for the present, obviously. But there are some sort of basic aspects to leadership that I do think sort of cross the ages, and one of them is responsiveness and the ability to listen, the ability to take criticism, to welcome criticism, to ask for criticism, and then to make a decision. And those qualities in leaders are typically admired whatever age you live in and whatever the issues are and whatever the sort of penal code looks like or the religious situation looks like, though. That's strong leadership.
Yeah, and for someone who grew up under Richard, decisiveness gets to be more valuable, I think, in your worldview and your view of kingship, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Henry V grows up, he's born in 1386. So he grows up seeing, as you know, as we've sort of described, seeing Richard II. So he has a good object lesson in how not to do kingship, as well as a good object lesson, and I try and make this point in the book, a good object lesson in how to, in the importance of performance, because Richard is majestic and he does perform kingship sometimes brilliantly. I mean, he doesn't really understand kingship, but he is good at public display. And I think although the public display that Henry puts on is not akin to Richard's, he sort of does anyway. Yeah, so he gets a lot from Richard. The magnificence, the majesty, the display is something that I think to an extent he emulates. Everything else is just a really, really easy way to do the job. If you just go, what would Richard II have done at this point? Okay, I'm going to do exactly the opposite because that guy was the mega doofus.
but a beautiful doofus.
They usually are, aren't they? I mean, that's often where doofusness comes from.
You got to be careful on your tour, as I keep seeing people on social media saying how beautiful you are. So be careful not to paint yourself as a doofus.
Yes, but I don't believe them. That's the thing. Or agree with them.
That's fair. Okay, so as Henry gets closer to kingship, he actually sort of makes a move too early. And I think this is a good part of the book, explaining not only that he becomes so secure and feeling like he can do this really well while his dad is ill, that he actually tries to sort of shove his dad aside. And the way that his father, Henry IV, so methodically shoves him out is actually quite beautiful when you're looking at it from this distance. I think if I was Henry V, I wouldn't be enjoying that too much, but it's a good moment.
Well, it's a great moment because it's an incredibly stupid error from the now, by this point, in his early 20s, Prince Henry. And it's, the more I think about it, the more I think it's to Henry IV's credit that he resists. At the point that the future Henry V, tries to persuade his dad, who's very ill, very unwell, and painfully unwell, they try to persuade him to abdicate. And Henry IV really digs his heels in and refuses, and then delivers an incredibly cold slap down to Henry, where he basically sort of exiles him, sends him away to think about what he's done, and lets him draw the impression, if not the conclusion, that it's possible that he's going to be replaced in the order of succession by his brother Thomas. Now, I don't think that's actually likely, but Henry IV puts up a good performance of it. And it's the right thing to do by Henry IV because he has spent his entire reign labouring under the consequences of not being a legitimate king, not having legitimately inherited that crown. And even though what Henry V to be is presenting is step down, let me step up, that would then leave Henry V with this question mark hanging over him for his entire reign, and nothing would have been solved. The Lancastrian, for another generation, the Lancastrian crown would have this question mark hanging over it. And that question mark is only going to evaporate when Henry IV dies and the crown is passed legitimately from father to son. So I think that Henry IV does absolutely the right thing, and largely to his own personal cost, because he, I'm sure it would have been quite nice for him to abdicate and have a rest and live out what remained of his increasingly painful years without the onerous responsibility of monarchy. But
provided he didn't get starved to death,
Well, and there's also that. I mean, is there a degree of self-preservation here? Because as Henry IV knows all too well, what do you have to do when you depose a king?
You have
Got
to get rid of the other one.
even if you think you're not going to. That was the, Edward II. Well, we'll just sort of he can be Edward of Carnarvon again and just live in a castle. Oh no, he can't. We're going to murder him. And you'll see it again with, Richard II. Well, we'll keep him somewhere, shall we? Let's stick him up in Pontefract. You can't get out of there. Oh no! The first hint of unrest among anyone in the kingdom. What's the first thing they're going to say? Let's get that other king back. You'll see it with Henry VI. They actually do get that other king back. And of course, you'll see it with the best decision Richard III ever makes in his life, which is to murder the princes in the Tower, because it would be moronic to do anything else.
Wow, you just threw that out
Little
there.
trolling for you guys. So, yes, there's, of course, the possibility that Henry IV might be thinking, well, yeah, it's all very well me abdicating, but what then? What am I just going to go live in the kind of retirement home for ex-kings? I think that's called being dead.
Yep. No, I think he does absolutely the right thing. And I think it's very wise. And it's incredible how well he achieves it, considering how well his son has stacked the deck against him. I think that it's a beautiful piece of political power for somebody who's having trouble getting out of bed. So eventually, Henry IV does pass away. Henry V does come to the kingship, comes to the throne. And then he takes up the war in France. Why does he care about France? Why does he care about France at all? It's like the claim to France is so old. Why does he pick this back up?
This idea of justice. And there's this sense that he's been kept alive. He's been saved at Shrewsbury for a reason. And that reason is to pursue justice. And what does justice mean in foreign policy terms? It means taking back what's wrongly, unjustly held that belongs to him, which is certainly Normandy, as he becomes to conceive it, probably everything that Henry II ever had in France. And then the crown, and this idea that Edward III had sort of claimed to be the rightful king of France was probably for Edward III almost always just a negotiating position. For Henry V, it's not. It's real. He's a literalist, or at least he is when it becomes evident that he has a puncher's chance of taking this, as the Burgundian Armagnac dispute, worsens and worsens, and they, endlessly start murdering each other. And so, yes, this is about the idea of, in some senses, divine justice. But it becomes kind of self-fulfilling, really, because the more Henry fights, the more he wins, and the more he wins, the more it's like, well, this appears to be what God wants. The success is proof that he needs to carry on. And the great case against Henry V is that he goes too far, and that, in fact, he's disastrously successful, because in actually claiming the crown of France and then dying at the height of his powers, as it were, he leaves a very difficult legacy for anyone who's not Henry V, which is, by definition, everybody. Although John Duke of Bedford is almost Henry V. John Duke of Bedford is a cigarette paper away from being the equal of Henry V. He's really good.
I've never heard that before, that he's a cigarette paper away. I was thinking, hair's breadth.
I was thinking hair's breadth, but then I also had a vulgar phrase in mind, and I was like really not trying to say what I was thinking. So I said, and then I thought, well, the polite phrase is a Rizzler, but I don't know if that translates out of England, where Rizzler is a brand of cigarette paper noted for its thinness.
I appreciate that. I appreciate all the effort that just went on behind the scenes. Yeah, John Duke of Bedford is universally praised, but this isn't really a podcast about him. So I suppose we should come back around to Henry V. So one of the things that you say, actually, the way that you end the book, is that everybody was surprised at what he achieved, probably except for him. So when he starts to invade France, do you think everyone is surprised? Who's surprised? Is anyone surprised by his successes?
I think everybody is surprised. Well, we talked about Henry Lord Scrope saying this isn't going to come to anything, and that's killer sort of part of the case against him during the Southampton plot, is that he doesn't believe in Henry's war. The French are saying it. There's spies are saying this guy does not seem to be a king. He's more like a monk than a king, and that's meant as an insult. It's a reference to Henry's sort of noted chastity, but it is also a reference to him just not seeming like. He doesn't strike people as the guy who's going to go and take the French crown. But as soon as he gets going, you've got to change your mind, haven't you? Because Harfleur comes tumbling down, and then there's this bizarre escapade that becomes the Battle of Agincourt, which in many ways is the second greatest blunder of his life after asking his father to resign the crown. It's mad. It's crazy what he does after Harfleur, to go sort of running pell-mell through French territory with just 8 days provisions, heading for Calais, just to show that he can. I mean, I know there is an argument that he's actually looking for a battle, but I think he'd rather avoid one if possible. It's the cheapest, quickest, if it goes right, way to sort of blow a raspberry at the French without losing any more men. But it doesn't go to plan, and he's very nearly wiped out completely.
Yes, it is a ludicrous gamble. It probably felt good to him at the beginning when he was asking towns to give him provisions, and they were like, okay. But then things just get worse and worse and worse until they're pinned down. So tell us a little bit about this battle now that we're here, because as you say in the book, this is not an original strategy that he's got going. The French know what he's going to do. How does this turn out for the English?
Everyone knows what the other side is going to do at Agincourt. There's no mystery. They all have time to think about it. We know from documents from the French side that they're very well aware how Henry is likely to fight at Agincourt, which is the only way he can fight. So he's got loads of archers. So he's going to do an Edward III at Crécy, which is line them up, try and create a sort of killing zone where anyone who charges into it will be cut down by volleys of arrows shot from longbows. That's the plan. There you go. Like, okay, do something about it. And the English know what the French are going to do. They've got heavy cavalry, loads of them. They're going to try and use weight of numbers and just barrel through and destroy those archer positions. And if they do that, then they'll win. So that's why Henry, when it becomes increasingly likely that a battle is going to take place, he orders all of his archers to cut themselves a 6-foot length of a large stick, a pole, sharpen it at both ends. You can drive it into the ground, and it'll have a big sharp sticky bit in front of it that you put in front of you. So if you're charged with a horse, the horse will either be gored or will rear and turn and create chaos in the French lines. Okay, simple. Both sides know what they're going to do. So who can execute it better? It's like a sports match. Man City is playing Barcelona. You know how both these sides play. Just who can execute their game plan better. And it's the English who do, and for lots of reasons. Ultimately because Henry's in charge. No one else is in charge. This is his battle. He chose to march, and he's got to front up. They don't really have a plan B. They can't afford to lose because it's all over. It's not just the campaign's over, they limp home. It's all over, and he's probably going to be deposed when he goes home. And that's that. It's that simple. So they have to win. And you see this, I wrote about sports for 10 years. This is actually a thing. That sometimes just one side doesn't just want it more, needs it more, and cannot lose. They can't afford to lose. And they don't, usually.
I mean, this is part of something that Henry would have read growing up. It's in Vegetius, right? Like, don't make it so that these people have no out, because if they have no exit, they will fight and they will win. And you don't want that.
Oh. A cornered animal is dangerous.
That's right.
Sports journalism.
We all know. They don't talk about Henry V, really? Oh, okay.
In sports journalism?
Yes.
Well, yes, of course they do. I mean, in English sports journalism, if England ever plays France in anything, all you're hearing about is this is the Battle of Agincourt again.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that sort of deep cultural resonance in the English psyche.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. So in the aftermath, Henry has a bunch of prisoners, but he's not going to be able to drag them around. He decides to execute them. This is a big moment.
Hold on.
What? Hold on, what?
Well, that's not the case. He has a lot of prisoners. It's not that he's not able to drag them around. They're perfectly able to drag them around. Dragging them around is no problem at all. In fact, they're preparing to drag them around. Dragging them around is what they're going to do. They're going to take them all back to England and sell them back to their families. And everyone's going to get rich on ransoms. The problem is that when it looks like the French are coming back to the battlefield and sort of banners are seen fluttering on the horizon, oh shit, who's coming back? Is it the French who ran away? Have they regrouped and they're coming back? Is this more fresh troops who are late to the party? Is it both? Who knows? But we might have to fight again here, and we can't fight again when everybody's got a Frenchman standing next to him. That's a big problem. What are we going to do? We've just miraculously won this battle that we had no right to win, and we haven't all died. And if this thing happens, we've snatched defeat from the jaws of victory, and we are actually all going to die, and it's going to not take very long because there's a French dude standing next to every single person on this battlefield. Kill them. It's the only thing you can do. There isn't another option. I don't see what the other option is, and I'm not, as a rule, pro-slaughter. Not like some mass murderer person. I wouldn't like that. I wouldn't like to be either end of that transaction, but I'm sorry. And all of this, like, oh, it was against the rules of chivalry, is for the birds. The French had taken the oriflamme. Kill them all, no quarter given, right? So what do? You say, hey, guys, okay, could you just go and stand on the other side of the battlefield again and we'll just start over? No, you can't do that. Do you say, could you just right, we're going to tie your hands up? What do you do? You have to kill them. It's not very nice. And no one actually is very happy about doing it either, but it's tough.
I'm not arguing with you.
I'm arguing with myself at this point. I'm arguing with like invisible straw men who surround me, telling me that Henry V shouldn't have killed the prisoners at Agincourt for reasons that basically amount to it wasn't nice.
It wasn't nice. I think we could all agree on that. I think Henry would agree with that as well. It wasn't nice. It's something that is always thrown at him, as you say. There's people who are always like, could he have done something else? And it was, I mean, he was especially, don't know if I want to say crucified for it, in the French Chronicles, of course.
Well, hold on. A lot of the French Chronicles say, don't blame him. They blame themselves.
Yes, that's true.
They say those idiots who made it look like they were coming back to the battlefield, it's their fault. Actually, vanishingly few people say bad Henry until about the 20th century.
You're right. So then, because I'm running out of time here, eventually Henry, he marries a French princess. They have Henry VI, guy who's going to be Henry VI. I usually hate to ask these questions, but do you think that there's kind of the James Dean effect? Because this is something that you do talk about at the end of the book, that because Henry dies at the height of his powers, do you think that's why he's remembered well? You think there's a point at which, maybe things would have gone south, considering he's stretched really thin in France?
I think it's a good argument. I think that had Edward III died in 1361, the year after the Treaty of Brittany, Black Prince still, peak of his powers, ready to step up, become king, Edward III would look far more magnificent than he usually seems, because he didn't die in 1361. He lived until 1377, which was, 16 years of drift and corruption and decay and the sort of slide into senility. And that inevitably tarnishes his historical reputation. Henry V died at 35 and, at the peak of his powers. Now, there were rumbling from 1420 onwards, once the treaty is signed and once Catherine is married to him, there are serious rumblings in England that actually what is going on now? Why are we still fighting? I thought we just won. Because now Henry is heir and regent to the crown of France. He's one belligerent in a French civil war, as well as being king of England. And so whenever he asks an English parliament for money or English nobles to loan him money, he's really asking them to fund a French civil war, which, no, thank you. So things are starting to become really difficult for him. And he's got this problem as well. He goes back to England in 1421 to try and raise money and leaves his brother Thomas in charge. And the first thing Thomas does is get himself killed at Beaujeu. And at that point, it looks very much like nobody can get a handle on this if their name is not Henry V. So I think he does benefit from having lived fast and died young. On the other hand, I don't think it was a completely impossible proposition, given that John, Duke of Bedford, then holds things together in France until 1429 and arguably 1435. It's an extraordinarily difficult situation to go from saying there should be a dual monarchy or that the English kings deserve to be kings of France to that actually being what they have to do. That's really tough. But not totally impossible. And Henry, had he lived, I don't think would have experienced any more difficulty with it than John, Duke of Bedford did. I mean, I think the great unknown is, or the great misfortune, at any rate, for the Lancastrian dynasty is that Henry dying just after his greatest achievement is not sort of a problem per se. The problem is that Henry VI is so young. And that means not only a minority, which are usually difficult, but it means nobody can renegotiate what Henry V had settled in 1420. That's the key point. Things have to just be held until Henry VI turns 18, effectively. That's the real problem, because anybody who tries to unpick what Henry V had done, that his name isn't Henry VI, is probably going to, at some point, find themselves accused of treason. So that's the problem. Had Henry V lived, he's got the option to renegotiate or bargain. He's got far more flexibility than the people he leaves it to. So you say, well, John Duke of Bedford, despite those impediments, held everything together till 1429/35. Imagine if you're Henry V and you have all the capabilities of John Duke of Bedford, but you're also you've got far more political latitude and freedom. Might have made it work. My suspicion, which I hint at the end of the book, is that Henry's mind was not on France so much anymore. It was turning towards Jerusalem. And he probably would have left John Duke of Bedford in charge of France and Humphrey Duke of Gloucester in England. He said on his deathbed, had I lived longer, I would have rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. And to an extent, yes, they all say that. But he had someone out in the East charting the territory and mapping it and making diplomatic outreach. He was reading books about the First Crusade. He was serious about this. Papal schism had been resolved in 1417. So it's not, the missing third act of the Henry V story could have been, okay, well, I've ticked off conquering France. Now I'm going to conquer Jerusalem. I mean, what is it more ludicrous? Yes, it is more ludicrous. Is it impossible? Probably for anyone other than Henry V. He seemed to be able to do things nobody else could do, and he and others got it into their heads that God just wanted him to keep winning. If you're going to be a crusader, that's a helpful attitude.
I think that the basis of all of crusading is that self-confidence that you can actually do it and achieve something. And I think that self-confidence is something that Henry V had, for sure. So you wrote this book about Henry V. You wrote it differently. You changed the perspective in that you shifted it a little bit earlier. What is it that you wanted to achieve with this book? What do you want to leave people with thinking about Henry V?
I hope that people enjoy the story, as always. That's really important to me. And I find it very gratifying. People are saying, I read the book, the book is just out. And people say, I read it in one day. I read it in one sitting. I read it in like a day and a half, this sort of thing. That's really encouraging to me, because I've tried so hard over the whole of my career, but with this book in particular, to make this material really exciting and compelling. It's a history book, but it's a really exciting story. So, number one thing is I hope people enjoy reading this book. I think it's also, much as Helen Castor's brilliant book, The Eagle and the Heart is, and I think our books do talk to each other, which is funny. She taught me everything when I was 18 years old. She was my supervisor at Cambridge. And so we've been discussing this stuff for a quarter of a century. And I think our books do speak to each other in a way. They're both studies in medieval kingship. And I hope that people, if they're interested in medieval history and in kingship, that there's more to this than just the Henry V story. It completes the set of Plantagenets, Wars of the Roses, that kind of triptych, which is all about subject of rule of kingship. So I hope that that's an important part, but it's more than that as well, because I think this is a case study in leadership in a time of crisis, and that's an apposite theme, I think, for the modern world. It's not like a parable or an analogy for like the US election or whatever, but it is a book that's on a topic that is of the moment, which is leadership in a world that seems in dire need of that.
I love it. I think that what people need to know about the way you write books is that you have an intention when you do it. You keep that at the forefront, and that is why they come together so well. So congratulations on the book. It's doing well already.
Thank you.
I hope it continues to do well.
It was lovely talking to you about it.
You too.
Thank you.
To find out more about Dan's work, you can check out his Substack at danjones.substack.com. His new book is Henry V, The Astonishing Triumph of England's Greatest Warrior King. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey, we have some good news for all medievalists.
What is it?
It's the British Library has brought back its digital manuscripts section.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank goodness. It's been a
Yeah.
long time.
Yeah, it's been close to a year since the cyber attack took down their website. And so we all lost access, which was over like 4,000 digital medieval manuscripts. And last week they started adding them on. There's a few hundred right now, but they promised to have more and more come along. So you can finally enjoy those many, many manuscripts in that beautiful art.
Oh, thank goodness, because that was an important resource. And I know that a lot of us were hurting because of it.
Indeed, indeed. The British Library is one of those huge collections of medieval manuscripts, and they had done a lot of good work digitizing them. I know I certainly used it all the time, and I think a lot of other people did too. So having it starting to come back is good news.
Yes, congrats to the British Library. Well done, everyone.
hmm Speaking of medieval manuscripts, we took a look back at the kind of famous viral photo from about 10, 12 years ago of where cat's paw prints were all over this medieval manuscript. It was something well loved. So we went back to the person who actually took the photo, Emir Filipic, to tell us his story of how he found it in the archives of Dubrovnik and how it actually went viral. It took actually several months before it really took off after it started online. So if you have a chance, just check it out. We have a few different views of this cast in ink over this beautiful page.
This is something that is very relatable to you these days, right?
Indeed, indeed. It's the equivalent of the modern day cat going over my computer's keyboard, which happens on a daily basis.
Yes, everyone will have to check that out and reminisce about not only this picture that probably a lot of us remember from a few years ago, but those moments with your pets where you're like, I'm so glad to have you. Please get off my work.
Yes. So we have all that plus 15 pitfalls to avoid while speaking.
While speaking.
Yes, medieval advice, probably aimed right at me.
Well, I mean, if they say, Peter, stay on the microphone, then yes, that is aimed at you 100%.
Indeed, indeed. I think Solomon has something to say about that.
Yes, and Aristotle, right?
Yeah, exactly. So check out all that and more on medievalist.net this week.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of you out there making my work possible, whether that's letting the ads play through, telling your friends about my books and podcasts, proudly wearing a 5-Minute Medievalist shirt from tpublic.com, or becoming a patron at patreon.com. Patronage is literally how I pay the bills, so if you love this podcast, please consider joining the Patreon community to help a girl out and keep the medieval content going. You can find out how at patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from Henry's to memories, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN-Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.